Wow, we're actually getting some breaking news here as we start recording.
Yeah, you are.
A powerful earthquake just hit eastern Cuba. And this is coming, right on the heels of a string of recent disasters that have just left the island reeling.
Yeah, this is a major event. We're looking at a 6.8 magnitude quake, and that's strong enough to cause really significant damage. Even under normal circumstances, this would be bad. But for Cuba, they've been through so much lately. This is like a knockout punch after they're already battered and bruised.
So, let's try to unpack this a little. The earthquake itself, it struck about 25 miles south of Bartolomé Maso, but the tremors were felt across a wide area, including Santiago de Cuba, and that's the country's second largest city. So, what is this magnitude? 6.8? What does that actually mean in terms of the potential impact? On buildings and infrastructure, especially considering what they've already been through.
Yeah, so imagine this. A 6.8 magnitude earthquake can topple buildings. You can see landslides, roads rupturing. We're talking about potential devastation here, especially for structures that are already weakened by these recent hurricanes. And, let's not forget, a lot of areas were still without power from those storms. And that could make rescue and recovery efforts so much more challenging.
Yeah, it's a race against time now to assess the damage and to make sure people are safe. I was just reading a story about Yolanda Tabillo, a 76-year-old woman in Santiago. She described the earthquake as just terrifying. Feeling her home shaking violently, having to rush outside during the aftershocks is just a stark reminder that behind all the numbers and the data we're talking about, there are real people whose lives are being completely upended.
Yeah, and her story is likely one of many, unfortunately. We can't underestimate the psychological impact of these repeated disasters. People are living with constant fear, uncertainty, always wondering when and where the next blow will strike. It's a heavy burden to carry, and the emotional toll on the Cuban people is immense.
And this earthquake is just the latest in a whole series of challenges they faced. So maybe we should rewind a bit for our listeners. Cuba was just hit by Hurricane Rafael, which was a Category 3 storm that caused really widespread power outages, destroyed homes, and forced hundreds of thousands to evacuate.
And even before that, don't forget about the hurricane that struck eastern Cuba back in October. That one also resulted in fatalities, unfortunately. And these back-to-back hurricanes had already stretched resources so thin, and you have communities that are just struggling to rebuild.
Right, and on top of that, they've been dealing with an energy crisis for a long time now. Remember those island-wide blackouts in October? It's a sign of just how vulnerable their infrastructure is and how these compounding disasters are really pushing them to the brink.
Yeah, exactly. This earthquake could further cripple their power grid, making it even harder to restore those basic services, like electricity, clean water. It's like a cascading effect, where each disaster makes the impact of the previous one even worse. It's really a perfect storm of challenges for Cuba.
It's hard to even imagine the stress and anxiety people must be feeling. They're trying to rebuild their lives from one disaster, and then, bam, another one hits. It feels relentless.
It's a heartbreaking situation, no doubt. And it's important to remember that this earthquake, it doesn't just impact buildings and infrastructure. It impacts people's lives, their livelihoods, their sense of security, and their hope for the future.
And we're going to dig deeper into those very real human consequences in just a moment. But first, let's kind of break down the potential economic fallout from this earthquake. Cuba's economy was already fragile. And, this could be a devastating blow, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's like trying to rebuild your house while the ground is still shaking. The economic impact of this earthquake is going to be immense, especially on top of everything else Cuba has been facing. It's like trying to rebuild your house while the ground is still shaking. The economic impact of this earthquake is going to be immense, especially on top of everything else Cuba has been facing.
Yeah. So let's break this down a bit. What are the key sectors of the Cuban economy that are going to be hit the hardest by this?
Well, tourism is a big one. Cuba relies so heavily on tourism dollars. And with all these images of the recent disasters, the hurricanes and now an earthquake, it's going to deter travelers. It's going to make them think twice about going there. Even if the damage in some areas isn't extensive, the perception of danger can be just as damaging.
Yeah, that's true. People might be hesitant to book a vacation to a place that seems like it's constantly under threat from these natural disasters.
Exactly. And then that loss of tourism revenue, it's going to ripple through the entire economy, impacting hotels, restaurants, transportation, and countless other businesses that depend on those visitors coming in. It's a domino effect.
And then we have to consider the cost of rebuilding, which must be astronomical at this point.
Hmm.
We're talking about repairing all that damaged infrastructure, providing shelter for those who've lost their homes, restoring basic services. It all adds up.
Oh, absolutely. And this is where Cuba's existing economic woes come into play. They're already facing shortages of essential goods, high inflation, and they've got a very limited budget to work with. This earthquake is just going to put an even greater strain on their resources.
So how do they even begin to tackle this? I mean, where will the money come from?
That's the big question. And the answer is complex. They're likely going to need significant international aid and humanitarian assistance, but even that comes with challenges.
Because of the U.S. embargo. I know that's been a long-standing issue, but honestly, I don't fully understand how it impacts their ability to recover from disasters like this.
Well, the embargo, which has been in place for decades, restricts trade and financial transactions between Cuba and the U.S., and this makes it incredibly difficult for Cuba to access international markets and attract foreign investment, both of which are crucial for recovery after a disaster like this.
So even if other countries are willing to help,
Yeah.
the embargo creates these logistical and financial hurdles
hmm
that make it harder for Cuba to actually get the support they need.
Exactly. It's like trying to climb out of a hole with one hand tied behind your back. The embargo just adds an extra layer of complexity to an already incredibly dire situation.
It's a heartbreaking situation for sure. And it's easy to feel overwhelmed by just the sheer scale of the challenges Cuba is facing.
Mm.
But in the midst of all of this, we have to remember the resilience of the Cuban people. I mean, they've faced hardship before, and they've always found a way to pull through.
You're absolutely right. And while the economic and political realities are incredibly daunting, the human element of this story is just as important, if not more so. How are people coping with this constant barrage of disasters? How are they supporting each other through all of this? How are they finding moments of hope amidst all this chaos?
Those are the stories we need to hear. So let's shift our focus now to the human impact of this earthquake and explore the extraordinary strength and resilience of the Cuban people. We've talked about the earthquake, the hurricanes, the blackouts, the economic fallout. It's a lot to process, but I keep coming back to the human cost of all this. What are the day-to-day realities for people in Cuba right now?
I mean, just imagine a life where you're constantly living on edge, where every tremor, every little shake brings back that fear of collapsing buildings and just the complete uncertainty of what's to come. I mean, for many Cubans, this is their reality right now.
Yeah, I mean, they're facing shortages of
TG.
basic necessities like
Mm.
food, clean water, medicine. And the power outages, I mean, they make everyday tasks a struggle. And then the damaged infrastructure makes it so difficult to just get around,
Mm.
to access healthcare or even just to check on loved ones.
It's a situation where simply surviving becomes the priority. Think about like trying to cook a meal for your family when you have no electricity, or trying to get to a hospital when the roads are impassable. These are the challenges Cubans are dealing with every single day.
And it's not just the physical hardships, right? It's the emotional toll as well.
Oh, absolutely.
The trauma of living through multiple disasters, the loss of loved ones, the uncertainty of the future. I mean, it's a heavy burden to carry.
You know, trauma affects people in different ways. Some might become withdrawn and isolated. Others might experience anxiety, anger. There's no right or wrong way to react to such a profound disruption of life.
But what strikes me is that even in the face of all this adversity, there's this remarkable spirit of resilience and community in Cuba. We've heard stories of people like helping each other out, sharing what little they have, finding moments of joy amidst all the chaos.
It's amazing, isn't it? It speaks to the strength of the human spirit. We have this innate capacity to adapt, to overcome, to find hope, even in the darkest of times. And the Cuban people, they're a testament to that, for sure.
It makes you wonder, what can we learn from their experience? What lessons can we take away from their resilience, their community spirit, their ability to find hope when faced with such overwhelming challenges?
Well, I think one of the most important lessons is the power of human connection. In times of crisis, we need each other more than ever.
Mhm.
We need to support each other, to share our resources, offer a helping hand whenever we can.
That's so true, and I think another lesson is the importance of resilience, of finding ways to adapt to constantly changing circumstances, and to be able to bounce back from setbacks. The Cuban people have shown us that even when it seems like everything is against you, the human spirit can endure.
Yeah, and perhaps the most important takeaway from all of this is that hope is essential. Hope is what keeps us going when times are tough. It's what allows us to see the possibility of a better future, even when the present is just filled with so many challenges.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the situation in Cuba, let's take a moment to just reflect on these lessons. Let's remember the resilience, the community spirit, and the hope of the Cuban people. And let's ask ourselves how we can cultivate these qualities in our own lives. so that we can face whatever challenges come our way with strength, with compassion, and with a belief in the power of the human spirit.